It started with a sound, not the thunder of a drag strip launch, not the scream of a NASCAR stock car charging into turn 1. It was something deeper, a sharp, metallic bark followed by a rising howl that didn't sound like a typical American V8 at all. Mechanics stopped what they were doing. Rival engineers glanced over the pit wall. They knew that noise meant trouble, because under the hood sat an engine Ford rarely talked about afterward. An engine so advanced, so expensive, and so misunderstood that it became one of Detroit's greatest forgotten masterpieces. Most people think the legendary Boss family begins and ends with the mighty 429. Others remember the high-revving Boss 302 that conquered the Trans Am Championship, but almost nobody talks about the middle child, the Boss 351. And that's exactly what makes this story so fascinating. Hidden beneath the shadow of its more famous brothers was an engine that many Ford engineers quietly believed was the finest small block they had ever built. So why did it disappear after just 1 year? Why did Ford pour thousands of hours into developing one of the most capable Cleveland V8s ever produced, only to walk away from it almost immediately? And why, decades later, are collectors willing to spend 6 figures chasing a car that barely survived its own era? The answers take us back to one of the most chaotic periods in American automotive history. By the late 1960s, Detroit was locked in an all-out horsepower war. Every major manufacturer wanted the biggest headlines, the quickest quarter-mile times, and the fastest cars money could buy. Chevrolet had its legendary big blocks. Chrysler unleashed the fearsome 426 Hemi. Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, and AMC all entered the battle with increasingly powerful V8s. Horsepower wasn't just a number anymore. It was advertising. It was prestige. It sold cars. Ford had no intention of sitting on the sidelines. The company already had an impressive lineup of performance engines. FE big blocks dominated endurance racing. The Boss 302 had earned its reputation in Trans Am competition. The massive Boss 429 existed primarily because NASCAR rules demanded production versions of racing engines. But engineers inside Ford knew there was still a gap. They needed something lighter than the Boss 429, more powerful than the ordinary 351 Cleveland, and durable enough to survive sustained high RPM without sacrificing street manners. They wanted an engine that could embarrass competitors both at the drag strip and on winding back roads. That challenge landed on the desks of Ford's engine development team in Dearborn. The foundation seemed obvious. The recently introduced 351 Cleveland already had enormous potential. Introduced for the 1970 model year, the Cleveland wasn't just another Windsor with bigger cylinders. It was an entirely different design. Its canted valve cylinder heads borrowed ideas from racing engines, placing the intake and exhaust valves at different angles to improve airflow. Larger ports allowed the engine to breathe exceptionally well at high engine speeds. That airflow would become its greatest weapon. The Cleveland featured a 4.00-inch bore paired with a 3.50-inch stroke, producing 351 cubic inches of displacement. Those nearly square dimensions gave engineers an ideal balance between torque and rev capability. Unlike long-stroke engines that ran out of breath early, the Cleveland loved to keep pulling, but there was a problem. Ford offered 2 primary versions. The standard 2-barrel engine focused on everyday driving, while the 4-barrel version used massive intake ports and larger valves. Those huge ports flowed incredible amounts of air at high RPM, but they also reduced air velocity at lower speeds. Drivers often complained that the engine felt lazy below 3,500 revolutions per minute before suddenly coming alive. It was fast, but it wasn't perfect. Instead of abandoning the design, Ford engineers saw an opportunity.
What if they combined the strongest Cleveland block with race-inspired internals? What if they borrowed proven hardware from the Boss 302 program? What if they built a naturally aspirated small block capable of revving like a racing engine while still surviving daily street use? That single question became the beginning of the Boss 351. Development wasn't cheap. Ford selected only the strongest 4-bolt main Cleveland blocks. Those reinforced main bearing caps dramatically reduced crankshaft movement under heavy loads. Forged connecting rods replaced weaker cast pieces. A forged steel crankshaft handled enormous cylinder pressures without flexing. The pistons were upgraded to forged aluminum, designed to withstand repeated high RPM abuse. Compression climbed to an aggressive 11.01. In 1971, that was serious business.
High compression improved thermal efficiency and boosted power, but it came with a cost. Premium high-octane gasoline became mandatory. Feed the engine cheap fuel, and detonation could quickly damage pistons or bearings. Ford wasn't building an economy car. They were building a machine that demanded respect every time the key turned. Then came the camshaft. Instead of using a mild hydraulic design, engineers chose a solid lifter mechanical camshaft with approximately 290 degrees of advertised duration and substantial valve lift. The trade-off was obvious. Valve lash required periodic adjustment, idle quality became rougher, and low-speed manners suffered. But once the tachometer climbed, everything changed. The massive 4 V-cylinder heads featured intake valves measuring roughly 2.19 inches and exhaust valves at 1.71 inches, among the largest fitted to any production small block V8 of the era. Airflow numbers exceeded many contemporary big block engines. At high RPM, these heads weren't just good, they were exceptional. To feed that airflow, Ford installed an aluminum high-rise intake manifold topped with a 750 CFM Autolite 4-barrel carburetor. Every component was selected with one goal: keeping the engine breathing freely above 6,000 revolutions per minute. Officially, Ford rated the Boss 351 at 330 horsepower at 5,400 revolutions per minute and 370 pound-feet of torque at 4,000 revolutions per minute. But almost nobody believed those numbers. You have to remember what was happening in Detroit at the time. Insurance companies had begun targeting high-performance muscle cars. Government regulators were paying closer attention to emissions. Manufacturers increasingly understated horsepower ratings to avoid unwanted scrutiny and reduce insurance penalties. Engine dyno tests conducted by enthusiasts decades later suggested the Boss 351 likely produced somewhere between 380 and 400 gross horsepower in factory form. Some experienced Ford builders have argued that with open exhaust and careful tuning, output edged even higher. If those estimates are correct, the Boss 351 wasn't just competing with the era's best small blocks, it was quietly outperforming many legendary big blocks. And yet, the biggest challenge wasn't making horsepower, it was proving that all of that engineering could survive when pushed to its absolute limit. The warning signs didn't appear on the dyno, they appeared after hours of relentless testing, when engines were torn down on workbenches under bright fluorescent lights. The horsepower numbers looked fantastic, but when mechanics removed the bearing caps and inspected the internals, they started finding evidence that something wasn't quite right. This engine wanted to live above 6,000 revolutions per minute. The oiling system didn't. Unlike many enthusiasts believe today, the Boss 351 didn't suffer from a fundamentally flawed design. The real issue appeared only when the engine was treated like a full-time race motor. During sustained high-speed operation, especially in long sweeping corners where oil sloshed away from the pickup, oil pressure fluctuations could become dangerous. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was enough to make Ford nervous. Ford's engineers responded with meticulous attention. Bearing clearances were carefully optimized, oil pump tolerances were tightened, internal oil control received constant refinement throughout development. Meanwhile, racers in the aftermarket began experimenting with high-volume oil pumps, improved oil pans, and windage trays. Those modifications would later become standard practice among Cleveland performance builders, but there was another challenge hiding inside those incredible cylinder heads. Those enormous 4V intake ports were engineering marvels at high RPM. Air rushed through them with astonishing efficiency. On a flow bench, they embarrassed many competing cylinder heads of the era. Out on the street, however, physics had a different opinion. At lower engine speeds, those giant ports slowed air velocity. Throttle response softened below roughly 3,000 revolutions per minute. Drivers expecting effortless low-end torque sometimes walked away disappointed. Then the tachometer swept past 4,000. Suddenly, the engine transformed. The intake roar deepened. The mechanical valvetrain came alive. The Cleveland heads finally reached the airflow range they'd been designed for, and the Boss 351 lunged toward redline with an urgency few American V8s could match. Automotive journalists noticed immediately. Road tests from 1971 praised the engine's willingness to rev and its unusual character. Unlike traditional muscle car engines that relied almost entirely on brute torque, the Boss rewarded drivers who kept it in the power band. It behaved more like a European performance engine wrapped inside a block of American cast iron. That made it special, but it also made it misunderstood. And then came the numbers. Exclusively in the 1971 Mustang Boss 351, the engine delivered performance that surprised nearly everyone. Contemporary magazine tests recorded quarter-mile times in the low 13-second range, with several well-driven examples dipping into the high 12s. Trap speeds frequently exceeded 105 miles per hour, placing the Boss among the quickest factory muscle cars available that year. Top speed approached 140 miles per hour. For a naturally aspirated 351 cubic inch street engine, those figures were remarkable. What's even more impressive is how little separated it from Ford's own big block offerings. The massive 429 certainly produced tremendous torque, but it also carried significantly more weight over the front axle. The lighter Boss 351 gave the Mustang better balance, quicker steering response, and a more agile feel on winding roads. Many owners quietly admitted something Ford rarely advertised. The smaller engine often felt faster. But there was one race the Boss 351 never truly got the chance to run. By 1971, the golden era of factory-backed muscle car racing was already beginning to fade. Insurance premiums for high-performance cars had skyrocketed. Buyers under 25 sometimes faced annual insurance costs approaching their monthly car payments. Meanwhile, looming emissions regulations forced manufacturers to rethink high-compression performance engines. The industry was changing almost overnight. And then the real nightmare started. Regular gasoline quality began declining as leaded fuels disappeared and octane ratings dropped. The Boss 351's aggressive 11.0 1 compression ratio had been engineered around premium high-octane fuel. As lower-octane gasoline became more common, detonation became an increasing concern. That distinctive metallic ping wasn't just annoying. Under heavy loads, it could crack pistons, damage ringlands, and pound rod bearings into submission. Ford engineers saw the writing on the wall. Future engines would need lower compression. They would need smaller camshafts. They would need cleaner emissions. Everything that made the Boss 351 extraordinary was suddenly becoming a liability. Inside Ford, difficult conversations were taking place. Building the Boss 351 wasn't cheap. The forged crankshaft cost significantly more than cast alternatives. Forged pistons added expense. 4-bolt main blocks required additional machining. The aluminum intake manifold wasn't inexpensive either. This wasn't a mass-market power plant. It was a hand-picked collection of performance components assembled into one remarkably capable package. Only one transmission was considered worthy: Ford's close-ratio top-loader 4-speed manual. There was no automatic option. Buyers also received a heavy-duty clutch, performance suspension, power front disc brakes, and a 3.911 traction lock rear axle as standard equipment. Ford wasn't interested in compromise. If you bought a Boss 351, you were buying a driver's car. Production reflected that philosophy. During the entire 1971 model year, Ford built just 1,806 Boss 351 Mustangs. Every single one left the factory with essentially the same purpose: delivering maximum naturally aspirated performance before the muscle car era came crashing to an end. That tiny production number would later make the car one of the rarest factory Boss Mustangs ever produced. But in 1971, rarity wasn't the goal. Survival was. Because outside Ford's factories, the automotive world was changing faster than anyone could have imagined. Horsepower ratings were about to be recalculated from gross to net measurements. Compression ratios across Detroit were falling dramatically. Catalytic converters, unleaded gasoline, emissions controls, and stricter federal regulations were rapidly reshaping the industry. Within months, the age of uncompromising factory muscle was effectively over, and the Boss 351 became one of its final masterpieces. Yet the greatest twist in this story was still waiting, because decades after Ford quietly ended production, enthusiasts would begin uncovering something that even many engineers hadn't fully appreciated at the time. The Boss 351 wasn't simply another Cleveland. It was arguably the ultimate evolution of Ford's original high-compression small-block philosophy. And once collectors realized that, everything changed. By the end of 1971, the writing was already on the wall. Ford had built one of the finest, naturally aspirated small-block V8s America had ever seen. It revved harder than most rivals, it breathed better than engines with far more displacement. It delivered race-inspired hardware straight from the factory, and yet just as it reached the showroom, the world that had inspired it was disappearing. Almost overnight, horsepower stopped selling cars, fuel economy became the new headline, insurance companies were hammering owners with premiums that sometimes rivaled annual car payments. Federal emission standards grew stricter every year. The upcoming switch to lower-octane unleaded fuel made engines with 11.01 compression increasingly impractical. The Boss 351 never had a chance to evolve. Instead of developing a second generation, Ford quietly ended the program after a single model year. The famous Boss name disappeared from the Mustang lineup. Just like that, one of the greatest performance engines Ford had ever engineered became history. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Unlike many forgotten muscle car engines that faded into obscurity, the Boss 351 refused to stay buried. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, drag racers began discovering what Ford's engineers had known all along. The Cleveland cylinder heads were extraordinary. Even in completely stock form, their airflow numbers remained competitive with many aftermarket heads that wouldn't appear until years later. Engine builders started experimenting. They cleaned up the ports, installed larger valves, added stronger valve springs, bolted on bigger carburetors and more aggressive camshafts. The results surprised everyone. Naturally aspirated Boss 351 combinations producing well over 450 horsepower became increasingly common. Fully developed race engines pushed beyond 500 horsepower while still relying on the original Cleveland architecture. With modern aluminum cylinder heads, aftermarket fuel injection, and forged rotating assemblies, some contemporary builds comfortably exceed 600 horsepower without forced induction. That kind of performance would have sounded unbelievable in 1971, and yet the original engineering had been capable of supporting it all along. The canted valve arrangement wasn't simply different for the sake of being different. By angling the intake and exhaust valves away from one another, engineers created a straighter path into the combustion chamber. The result was greater volumetric efficiency, better high RPM breathing, and remarkable power potential. Even today, professional engine builders still praise the Cleveland head design. That's an incredible legacy for a production casting introduced more than half a century ago. Of course, the aftermarket also solved many of the concerns racers had identified decades earlier. High-capacity baffled oil pans reduced oil starvation during hard cornering. Priority main oiling modifications ensured the crankshaft received lubrication before the upper valvetrain. Roller rocker arms reduced friction. Modern synthetic oils offered protection engineers in 1971 could only dream about. Piece by piece, enthusiasts finished the work Ford never had the opportunity to complete. And then the collector market noticed. During the 1990s, prices for authentic Boss Mustangs began climbing rapidly. The Boss 302 remained the household name. The Boss 429 became the ultimate investment-grade Mustang. But quietly, almost unnoticed, the Boss 351 started earning respect from people who understood exactly what it was. Collectors realized only 1,806 examples had been built. Many had been raced. Others had been modified beyond recognition. Some simply rusted away. Finding an original, numbers-matching Boss 351 became incredibly difficult. As demand increased and surviving cars became scarcer, values exploded. Today, a well-preserved factory-correct Boss 351 can easily command well into six figures at major collector auctions. Exceptional low-mileage examples have sold for substantially more. Ironically, the engine Ford barely had time to celebrate became one of the most desirable Mustangs it ever produced. So why did Detroit seem reluctant to talk about it for so many years? Part of the answer is timing. The Boss 351 arrived at exactly the wrong moment. Had it debuted in 1968, it might have become the centerpiece of Ford's performance lineup. Had emissions regulations arrived 5 years later, Ford might have refined the platform into an entire family of high-performance Cleveland engines. Instead, it landed during the collapse of the muscle car era. Its story was overshadowed by tightening regulations, changing consumer priorities, and the industry's rapid shift toward lower compression designs. The Boss 351 wasn't a failure. It was simply born too late. And perhaps that's what makes it so fascinating today. It represents the final expression of an era when engineers were told to chase performance first and worry about everything else later. Every forged component, every oversized valve, every high-compression piston reflects a mindset that would soon disappear from Detroit for decades. You can still hear it whenever one fires to life. The idle isn't perfectly smooth. The mechanical lifters produce a faint metallic rhythm. Open the throttle, and the induction roar builds into a sharp, unmistakable scream as the tachometer races toward redline. It doesn't sound like compromise. It sounds like the closing chapter of America's original horsepower war. And that's why the Boss 351 continues to earn admiration from enthusiasts more than 50 years later. It wasn't the most famous Ford engine. It wasn't produced in the greatest numbers. It didn't enjoy decades of factory promotion. Instead, it earned its reputation the hard way, through engineering, through performance, and through the respect of the people who truly understood what was hiding beneath those valve covers. In the end, the Boss 351 wasn't just another Cleveland-powered Mustang. It was Ford's ultimate factory small block of the classic muscle car era, a machine built with forged internals, 4-bolt mains, 11.01 compression, massive canted valve heads, and the kind of engineering ambition that would soon vanish under the weight of regulations and changing times. Sometimes the greatest automotive legends aren't the ones everyone remembers. They're the ones history almost forgot. If you enjoyed uncovering the real story behind Ford's forgotten masterpiece, let me know in the comments which legendary engine deserves the next deep dive. And if you love the untold stories behind the machines that shaped automotive history, make sure to subscribe, because there are still plenty of forgotten legends waiting to be rediscovered.